Tonight, we're talking about fashion. Medieval fashion. Specifically, the kind of fashion that could get you fined, flogged, shamed in public, or dragged before a magistrate because you had the audacity to wear the wrong color of wool to market on a Tuesday. Congratulations. You've just woken up in medieval England. The year is somewhere in the 1300s. You don't know exactly what to wear today, but the Crown, the Church, and your neighbor Agnes all have very strong opinions about it. And at least one of them has the authority to make your mourning considerably worse. In medieval England, getting dressed wasn't a personal choice. It was a public declaration. Your clothing was a walking announcement of your rank, your income, your occupation, and your moral character, all broadcast simultaneously before you'd said a single word. You didn't just put on clothes in the morning. You put on your place in the world. And God help you if your place didn't match what you were wearing. This wasn't considered oppressive by most people living inside it. It was considered orderly. The medieval worldview was hierarchical, running all the way up to God. Dressing outside your rank wasn't just rude. It was a challenge to the cosmic order. You weren't just wearing the wrong hat. You were suggesting that God's arrangement was negotiable, and medieval England was not a place that found that suggestion charming. Let's talk about the sumptuary laws. These were actual, enforceable pieces of legislation passed by Parliament that told you what fabrics you were allowed to wear, what colors were off limits to your income bracket, and exactly how much ornamentation was acceptable for someone of your station. They weren't suggestions. They were laws, and breaking them had consequences. The first major English sumptuary law appeared in 1337, and from there, things escalated with the enthusiasm of a government that had just discovered it could regulate hem length. Purple. Just a color. Except in medieval England, it was not just a color. It was a declaration of power so loaded that wearing it without the right bloodline was essentially a challenge to the natural order. True purple came from a sea snail called the murex. It took thousands of snails to produce a tiny amount of dye. The result was a color so expensive that only the wealthiest people in the known world could afford it. Wearing purple without royal permission invited scrutiny, and scrutiny in medieval England had a way of leading to places you didn't want to go. Scarlet cloth was its slightly more democratic, but still aggressively gate-kept cousin. A dense, high-quality wool dyed a vivid red. Wearing it was a statement: I have money, land, or both, and I would like everyone in this market square to know it. For a successful merchant who had quietly accumulated more wealth than some minor lords, it was a temptation, and one the sumptuary laws existed specifically to resist. And then there was fur. In medieval England, fur wasn't just a material. It was a ranked system. Different furs were legally designated for different classes. Ermine, the white winter coat of the stoat with signature black tail tips, was reserved for royalty. Miniver for the upper nobility. Squirrel fur for the prosperous. Regular people could have lambskin if they were lucky. The system was so detailed that you could theoretically look at a person's collar and know their annual income. It was the medieval equivalent of a credit score, only worn visibly and policed by people with actual authority to arrest you. And the shoes. At some point in the late 14th century, someone in the English court looked down at their shoes and decided the toes were not pointed enough. The poulain was born. A shoe with a tip that extended far beyond the foot, sometimes 12, 18, even 24 inches past the toes. They needed to be stuffed with moss or hair to hold their shape. Walking required a particular shuffling gait. Running was simply not available as an option. Edward IV eventually passed a law in 1463 capping shoe length based on rank. It is one of the only moments in English legal history where a government looked at footwear and said, measurably, that is enough. The real problem cases for the sumptuary laws were the merchants. Successful English merchants had accumulated genuinely substantial wealth. Some had more coin than minor lords, and they wanted to dress like it. This was, from the Crown's perspective, unacceptable. The laws aimed directly at this problem, setting income thresholds for who could wear what. The successful merchant occupied an uncomfortable social position. Too wealthy to be ignored and too lowborn to be accommodated. The Church also maintained vigorous opinions about clothing and vanity. Sermons regularly addressed the sin of excess dress. Priests warned that elaborate clothing was pride made visible. Pointed shoes were compared to devil's claws. Elaborate headdresses were described as the horns of sin. Women in particular were lectured about modest dress and the spiritual peril of anything attractive. The overlap between religious judgment and legal enforcement created a double layer of scrutiny. By the 15th century, the headdress had become something extraordinary. The henning, a tall conical hat worn with a veil, could reach 2 feet or higher. They required structural engineering. They got stuck in doorways. They were physically incompatible with most forms of transport. And yet women wore them, because in the aristocratic world, your hat communicated your position. The Church hated them. Preachers compared them to horns of the devil. Fashion largely ignored both. And what about the people who had no choice at all? Servants wore livery, their employers' colors on their backs. Prisoners wore what they were assigned. Outcasts wore what they were required to wear, announcing their exclusion. At every level of the sumptuary system, the underlying logic was the same. Clothing was information, and information was power, and power in medieval England was jealously guarded. The sumptuary laws are gone. The fur hierarchy has dissolved. Nobody is measuring your shoe. And yet the instinct that produced all of it, the desire to make identity visible, to communicate status through what we wear, that instinct is not gone at all. It just wears different fabric. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed, in your comfortable clothes, free to wear any color you can afford, spare a quiet thought for the medieval merchant who paid his fine and kept the silk trim anyway. For the noble lady who negotiated a doorway in a 2-foot henning. For the peasant in undyed wool who saved his Sunday tunic carefully and wore it with dignity once a week, in a world that had decided in writing, by Act of Parliament, that this was his correct place. They dressed themselves every morning. They stepped out into the world. And the world read them at a glance. Sleep well.